go to Wayne in Epsom about this. Morning to you, Wayne.
Morning.
Morning.
So you've had a heart attack, and the operator says, oh, "Listen, look, hang on." He says, he looks out the window and says, "Yeah, we've got another 3 hours and 40 minutes on the charge for the ambulance. Do you think you could hold on, Wayne? Do you think you could give yourself some CPR to get yourself going?" What do you say to that?
Well, you couldn't give yourself one of them electric shock thing machines because they'd be flat as well.
Oh, yeah, ironically, they need to charge, don't they?
Yeah, exactly. But no, it's all to do with the control of the population, because electric cars are unaffordable because you have to keep replacing the batteries because they go bad after a few years. And if you're in a 15-minute city, then you can get to the hospital and the ambulances don't go so far. So the population has to be concentrated and controlled.
The problem is, though, that we don't have the infrastructure for 15-minute cities. And of course, anyone that criticises the 15-minute city, which is, of course, sold as, oh, my God, everything will be like within a 15-minute walk and it's going to be utopia and there'll be a unicorn coming up and outside your house and saying morning to you, is called a far-right extremist or a conspiracy theorist.
But at the end of the day, the technology that they're pushing with the batteries comes from China. The advisors to the government, there was a few, shall we say, Chinese state actors advising our government, which came out in the media a few years ago. So it's not much of a reach to believe that the Chinese want this, whereas the Japanese want hydrogen power. They have hydrogen fuel cell cars as well as hydrogen compression engine cars.
What's interesting, and I'll look this up because I just want to make sure I'm correct on this story. I think Porsche are now no longer going for electric. They're saying that the push into electric cars will hit their profits. But I'm pretty sure it was something that many of the big premium car brands are looking into synthetic fuels or other types of fuels. I know you mentioned hydrogen, because they have no faith in electric vehicles either, and they only themselves see it as a passing phase until something better comes along that's going to be way more reliable.
Oh, yes, and the government wants you to buy all electric cars so it can get tax off of that. Then when they fail and you go to hydrogen, then you have to replace your car and give tax to the government again.
Yes,
it's a
absolutely. And that's
income stream.
Precisely what they did with diesels. Because diesel didn't actually have lower emissions, but of course, let's not forget that half the emissions details were being fiddled when it came to diesels, which led to the big scandal. But the argument with diesels was also, look, the emissions might not be much lower, or might be, on a par with petrol, but because you get so many more miles to the gallon, it ends up better. It ends up being driven for longer. And of course, then as soon as that was realised to be a load of old nonsense, they brought in things like the ultra-low emission zone, and the very Labour mayor that was part of the government that brought in the drive for diesel vehicles was then the mayor that brought in the ultra-low emission zone. So it's all a way of just fleecing us. And it's so annoying, actually, because Renee might disagree with me, and thank you for your call, Wayne, but it's so annoying because the arguments about us having cleaner air and a nicer environment, less rubbish, it's frustrating that some of those, I think, nice arguments, good arguments, no one's going to argue against those things, I think get lost because of this nonsense. And if I was someone who actually, I am someone who thinks, look, having a nicer environment, cleaner air and all that stuff is great.
Well, who wouldn't think that was great?
Well, unfortunately, those people who also get clouded by thinking it's all a ruse to charge us, which, of course, most of the time it is.
It is. And the other thing is I actually believe that the reason those good ideas and selling points are getting clouded is because the people who are trying to implement this don't give a damn about those things. They're just hell-bent on implementing everything they can to reach those targets, which we're going to reach anyway because we're so far down the line. But there's just this obsession with looking like the most virtuous country who's ticking all the boxes and doing what other countries...
This was where Tony Blair, a few months ago, made a good point, and it is not something you say very often.
No, it's not something you say very often.
Not something I say very, very often, absolutely not. But he said, it was on one of the front pages a few months ago, and I quote this quite a lot because I thought it was a great deal of common sense. He said that it is ridiculous and it is of no consequence to keep hammering the working people here in the UK when it comes to environmental targets and the like. What we would be better off doing is using the United Kingdom's great deal of technology, great deal of entrepreneurial skills, vigor, to actually come up with the technology so that we can go to China and India and say, look, you don't need to change your standard of living. We have come up with a way in which you can continue your standard of living, but also that's how you get down to reducing your carbon footprint, rather than us reducing our carbon footprint even further when it has no impact on what those countries are doing. Do you think charging us for ultra-low emission zones makes any difference to what's happening in the world as a whole? Of course not.
Well, of course not, but it doesn't actually make any difference to our society or world as a whole. What it does is it gives, one particular, political party at the time in that town extra money. We all know that, Christo. Everybody knows that our system is currently broken, and all of these things, ULEZ, LTNs, are just designed to make money for people that are bankrupt, government organisations that are bankrupt. But the other thing is, Christo, is we're nowhere near the technology that's going to say that is going to not impoverish us. All of this will impoverish us, both financially and our standard of living.
OK, Tony Blair has cautioned, this was from July last year, Tony Blair has cautioned against asking the public to do a huge amount to tackle climate change because Britain's net zero efforts alone cannot solve global warming. He said that climate change was a global challenge. Britain should play its part, but what Britain could achieve was dwarfed by the impact of actions of countries such as China. And so therefore, and this was just as the ultra-low emission zone in London was about to be introduced, so it was a big debate going on at the time. And he said, basically, don't ask us to do a huge amount when, frankly, whatever we do in Britain is not going to impact climate change. The number one issue today, and this is where Britain could play a part, is how do you finance the energy transition? Because basically the developed world's emissions are going down, but the developing world's are going up. So these countries have got to grow. So how do you finance the transition and how do you accelerate the technology? So he says that basically our role, again, should be helping them to try and live their lives, have a good standard and bring down their carbon emissions, because hammering us makes no difference.
So whilst I agree with that, I actually think he's wrong that is the number one question. The number one question should be, are we actually influencing climate change? Is anything anyone in the world does going to change climate change? I've been listening this week to meteorologists have a view on the NHS and electric ambulances, talking about how we have just had our wettest winter. What they never say now is we also have El Nino that we didn't have 2 years ago.
What would you say to the meteorologists, though, that say that it is absolutely down to the humans that have created...
No, so what they say is, firstly, they can't prove that, Christo. They cannot prove it. And then they'll say, if you challenge them, 99% of scientists agree with you. Would you know what, in COVID, 99% of scientists agreed that the vax were the most wonderful thing that ever happened. But then
do you think that those scientists who believe it's humans that create it, and I don't want this to become a debate about is climate change real or not, because I think that...
Climate change is real.
Yes, but I mean the causes of it.
Right.
But do you believe that the scientists then are wrong, or do you believe that they're part of are deliberately getting it wrong? Why is there such consensus among scientists?
So it's just not as black and white as that. What you have to understand is the way that research works in the world now is that you only get your research money if you ask the question that's going to deliver the answer to the current theme. We saw it all the way through COVID, and now that's slowly being exposed. We're seeing it with climate. You cannot get a research grant now, Christo, unless what you are asking is to try and prove that net zero is
You and my dad
happening.
should go for coffee. No, seriously, my dad thinks, and I love my dad dearly, he thinks it is all a massive scam. He just thinks
so
that
I didn't say it was a massive scam.
I'm not saying that you're saying
Right.
that. I'm just saying that he'd love you for that, because he goes a step further and he thinks it's just a scam, and that I don't think he thinks that it doesn't exist, but I just think he is so jaded with it. He's just like, oh, it's just a load of old rubbish and they're just doing it to charge us.
Do you know what? If it didn't exist and we could make all of these changes without diminishing people's standard of living and costing them a fortune, I'd say, fine, let's do it. Why not? But the fact that we absolutely don't know who's causing climate change, but we are going to impoverish people, we are going to send them back to the 1900s.
Yeah, but scientists would disagree with you. Scientists would say, we do know.
Yeah, but it's that statement that's a nonsense, because...
But there are many scientists who wouldn't think it was a nonsense.
There are, of course there are.
Yeah, but there are many... Yeah, exactly. So
yeah,
we agree.
There are, but people will say 99% of scientists. People need to understand scientists have got jobs, they've got tenure. If they say anything out of the... Look, for example, let's look at the transition, Kathleen Stock, one of the greatest philosophers of our time and professors at one of our best universities, left because she happened to say that biological sex is real. Now, that's a fact.
So I understand the point you're making, that if you don't stick to a narrative and stay in your lane, you end up being discredited. But the counter-argument to that, and I'm just trying to be balanced, is that you would lose your integrity, and there might be some scientists that say, well, look, I believe this to be true because I wouldn't come up with something to justify my research, Grant, because it would completely ruin the fact that I was a scientist. It would discredit the fact that I'm a scientist. I would have no professional integrity.
I once went on to another TV channel during COVID as a head-to-head about COVID vaccines and why they shouldn't be given to children because I saw the myocarditis signal. Yes. The scientist who argued against me came up with all of these figures that he basically made up on the night. He was treated like a god. It was all designed to vilify me. After the show, when I did the research, it transpired that scientist's funding for his research came from Moderna.
That's interesting.